Good morning, everyone. My name is Riyong Kim. I am leading the program on biodiversity and ecosystems at the European Environment Agency. Just to say, my background is as a natural resource economist. I've been working a lot with metrics. I've been out in the Congo, in Brazil, in Indonesia, looking at how we actually start metricizing and capturing the value of how people are using their nature. So this topic is super interesting, and I think we're going to have a really nice day today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we do, but most of all, I'll start off with the case for financing nature. And just to start here, I mean, this is coming from our latest state and outlook of the environment report in 2020. This is what we call the piano table. The top row is basically the past trends over the past 5 to 10 years, and I think the colours give, the normal indications. The bottom row is basically the outlook to 2030, and if we just concentrate on natural capital, we can see that it's not getting better. It's just going worse, and maybe there's a lot of effort that has been put into the low carbon, but the trends in general are not looking very good. So there is a need for systemic and transformative change. Here you've got an X-curve, and this is something that we work with quite a lot, but we need policy levers to really support sustainability transitions. The red curve is basically trying to phase out unsustainable models of producing and consuming, and the green curve is then phasing in sustainable modes of producing and consuming. And this is really about how do we create the space and the niche for innovations to actually break through that can actually start, practicing this new form of sustainability and bringing us out of the lock-in of our old systems that are actually really not conducive to sustainability. I wanted to maybe make a bit of a distinction between the different sustainabilities as well, and I'll delve a little bit deeper as to why this is important in terms of nature. Nature needs strong sustainability, and I think some of the academics have worked with a lot of the terms such as weak and strong sustainability, ecological economics, these different things. We like to classify this as sustainability 3.0 and beyond. And essentially it requires what 3.0 and beyond means is actually changing our business models rather than actually greening them. And this table was actually taken from a report that we commissioned in my previous work on aligning finance for the net zero economy, written by a key actor in mission innovation. And he basically helped to categorize what are the actions in the financial sector that need to happen along these different sustainabilities. And if you start with number one, just communicating the need for action is just divesting out of some of the highly carbon emitting assets, for example. 1.5 is then looking at improving operations in the existing systems, maybe changing to a bit of a greener shade. Sustainability 2, which is delivering solutions to help reduce emissions. These might be your green loans, progressive shareholder engagement. And it's only in the 3.0 and beyond that we're talking about how companies actually change some of their business models to not be as resource intensive, to potentially look at other types of inputs, to potentially look at changing their business models or business, objectives to actually fit in with that sustainability paradigm. And the focus here is really, it really connects to the IPCC report that came out, the special report in 2020, where for the first time the IPCC actually developed a low energy demand scenario. And it's one of the first times that they actually said that a scenario could be not only carbon capture and storage, like business as usual, capture that, and then we can come down to the 1.5, but actually a scenario where we're saying, how do we start looking at not using as much energy as we have before? And that means if we're talking about cars, it's not about replacing every car with an electric car, it's actually thinking about our mobility systems. So this was really the thinking behind this, and this was also done at a time which really, we saw the wave of climate finance really taking off. There was a lot of institutions interested in capturing the metrics there. Moving on, now in the context of biodiversity and ecosystems, we've got really good knowledge of how pressures and impacts on nature are playing out. So climate change has an impact on nature. We're polluting Mother Earth. Invasive alien species are really destroying the species diversity. There's overexploitation. There's habitat loss. Humans are a factor. And one of the key things that we've been working on in our agency is flipping that narrative. So as basically telling the story of why we need healthy biodiversity and ecosystems, because in themselves and in the ecosystem services they provide, they can actually protect our water, they can ensure our food supply and our security, they can break down and absorb pollution, they can help climate stability and recovery from events and minimize risk to health. So these are the kind of flipping of narratives that we need to actually make aware for the public as well. On the policy front, we know that there's a big financing gap of about 4.1 trillion, which is a huge challenge to actually implementing the global biodiversity framework. On the EU level, we've just had a proposal on the nature restoration law. It's a must-do for the EU 27, and soon financing is actually going to be an issue. Some recent figures have shown that on a per-year basis, we're going to need something along the lines of 130 billion per year just for the green transition in nature alone. And in the nature restoration, it's basically the first continent-wide comprehensive law of its kind, which is basically going to make binding targets to restore degraded ecosystems. So imagine all the member states are now going to have to look at the marine, agro-ecosystems, forest, freshwater, riverine connectivity, and actually have a certain target of 20% to restore by 2030, and by 2050, it will be all ecosystems in need of restoration. So this is a huge achievement, but now it's in process and under debate, and so it hasn't landed yet, and it's in the council negotiations. This is from the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and you can see the line is our global biodiversity loss and everything that needs to be done to actually reverse that loss. Conservation, climate change action, reducing other drivers, sustainable production, and reduced consumption. And basically what I'm trying to say here, it's not one action alone, it's not through restoring biodiversity that we achieve this, but it's through all these different actions at once. So the Green Deal, as it has been introduced, has a very systemic logic. It's very interconnected. It's posed strategies on a lot of the different sectors which are trying to interplay with each other in a move towards the sustainability. Very quickly, sustainable finance as it is now. I don't need to tell a lot of you. You probably know a lot of the actions that are happening here. Corporate disclosure, so far voluntary reporting standards. There are some examples of mandatory disclosure, the French law that makes that mandatory. Who does it serve? Shareholders, investors, regulators. But the key problem, and maybe more from the side of when we're looking at the nature issue, is the risk lens. And this is where the double materiality is really key here, because we need to look at not only the risk to the companies, but what are the companies' risks to nature as well. And a large part of the EU sustainable finance policy of what we've been working on is actually strengthening and harmonising, so we can get better disclosure from the corporates. In my mind, that's not enough, but we'll take that a bit later. Then we've got the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which is helping us categorise what is green and brown. And to the question that was posed earlier, this might be one way in actually helping us starting to differentiate what is actually green or not. But you know that these categories have been hotly debated. A whole group of NGOs walked out on the whole process because nuclear was suddenly green. Science-based targets itself, this is a very interesting figure where 76% of identified heavy emitter companies with science-aligned net zero targets, but almost 25% of them don't actually even publicise their milestones beyond what they're mandated to do. So is this an exercise in brand leadership? And then lastly, we've got a whole array of innovative financing mechanisms, not only for climate, but also for nature. But their key challenge, and you mentioned the RED example before, are their challenges of governance. Who owns this? Who actually has the rights over this? And it comes back down to some really basic, fundamental ideas, such as Ostrom on the goods, governance of the goods. There's lack of return, and that will always be an issue. Impact metrics, there's not enough. This is basically not enough to reverse the loss of biodiversity. But there is a key role of these instruments in helping to overcome some of the barriers to investment. And this is where I wanted to then put it back to its roots, and it's coming back to where I originally got trained, which is in the economics. It's not a given. The system is something that has been developed, but to internalise nature, and this is just a quote from a recent report we commissioned, finance as it is today has to separate it into fragmented pieces in order to invest in it. And so climate solutions based on Western knowledge systems tend to miss the complexities and interconnections for ecosystem health. So in essence, what the economic system as it is, it places nature outside the system. And what we need to start understanding is the biosphere is the fundamental system. And this is really where the donut economic paradigm is one which looks at the core, our boundary is essentially the resources that we actually have on Earth. We can't think incrementally. We need to understand these systemic effects, and we need to shift horizons. So no more of the short-term horizons, but much more of the intergenerational and long-term. And the European Green Deal is our playing field, and there's a very strong systemic transitions logic that I was talking about here as well. I'll skip over this. This is about basically a taxonomy of nature. Nature's goods and services, and you can see here that the key problem is with your non-rival and non-excludable goods, because there, you cannot exclude anybody. They are continually regenerating. So how do you govern something like that? How do you create a law or regulation in the use of that? Who has the actual proprietary rights for this? And I'm really looking forward to the next discussion on basically, maybe there's thoughts around some of these things as well. Financing nature, just briefly, investments in nature are challenged by significant barriers. There needs to be a better coherence. And I know I've just spoken about the European Green Deal being our anchor, but there are still key discrepancies within that. When we have under the CAP Common Agricultural Policy, we have subsidies which promote one way of working, but at the same time we've got a restoration law which is working towards restoring. This is where the coherence doesn't quite meet. And so we need better coherence and improved frameworks in that respect. We have some legacy finance instruments which are unfit for natural capital and market size and structure. There's limited access to finance and resources to implement investments. And importantly, when it comes to actually putting money into nature, it's very difficult to track impact. And this last point is really exacerbated, and especially because we work a lot with biodiversity data. It's because there is a lack of sufficient biodiversity data at the business level. There's no standardized biodiversity impact matrices for investors and vice versa. And the understanding of the private and public benefits of different types of biodiversity is really low as well. So, for example, what's the difference between common farmland birds and rare mountain plants? And what is the value of that, for example? What's needed? I'm sorry for all the text, but in essence, if I capture that, it's more specific and local data at the business level to actually help assess biodiversity impact. And I'm not saying that this is easy. We struggle with it. We've been struggling with it for 20 years. How do you know and how do you adequately track that a certain species has returned to an area? And that is not easily done. It's often based on citizen science. It's often, relying on a lot of new technologies such as eDNA. And we need to start looking at new innovative tools to help us track these kind of things. Geospatial tools and standardized biodiversity impact matrices are needed so that we have a common baseline for understanding what does good biodiversity impact look like? What does good restoration mean? And how do we align some of those definitions across all these different actors who are trying to do biodiversity investments? Biodiversity impact models are needed for different types of activities, so for farming and fishing versus manufacturing and mining, and mechanisms for combining public and private is also needed. And on the basis of that, EEA is actually starting to work a lot more with the monitoring bodies, financial institutions and companies and countries to actually start learning on how we create a stronger biodiversity data foundation. In a nutshell, and I'll skip over the last slides because I know I'm already over time, but this is what we do. For those who didn't know us, we are a data agency. We work in supporting the implementation of environmental directives in the biodiversity strategy, and you can see the 4 pillars in protection, restoration, enabling transformative change, and in the global agenda, and also in the sector systems of sustainability. And now we've started to look a lot more broader and taking the biodiversity conversation outside of just the silos of species, richness and abundance, and started to connect that to the sectors of fishing, farming, what does it mean for pollution, marine litter, bathing water, climate change, financing. And this is what we need to do if we're actually going to try and reverse some of the patterns of biodiversity loss. I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Okay.
You talked about the lack of standardized metrics and also the difficulty of finding reliable data on biodiversity and the lack of tools.
Yes.
So how can we speed up the process of finding reliable measures and data and tools?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, this has been an eternal problem in biodiversity and tracking basically what does good nature restoration and protection look like. I think we've got a whole array of possibilities with satellite Earth observation. So EEA currently works with Copernicus, and we're hoping to use a lot of that capability to track the extent of restoration in Europe's nature. And by proxy, we would like to maybe start understanding how does a restored habitat, is that restored habitat then creating the biodiversity that we need? But of course, there's a huge knowledge gap that we have there. And also we have lots of research organisations and consortiums that are working on new ways of biodiversity monitoring, which is going to become, a very huge challenge. But we're working on it, essentially. And we need to find a way that is much more accessible for the general public, but also for investors and other users of that data to quickly access that type of on-time biodiversity data.
When I have discussions with Standard & Poor's, Sustainalytics and Moody's, they admit that it's garbage in, garbage out. But there is this massive demand for these products. And if you review in empirical studies, the correlation between the indices, this biodiversity indices and ESG, I mean, it's like 40-60%. If we look at credit rating, it's 99.5%. So, I mean,
there's a long way to go.
It's a long way to go.
Well, I mean, just to say, we do work with a lot of the EU nature directives, and a lot of our data actually comes from member states themselves. So it is reporting that they come in with. But again, a lot of that might be based on citizen science. So ornithologists on their weekend, they're tracking in and saying, we've seen this bird. But we're not better than that. And so this is why we're really relying on a new generation of tools, such as eDNA, that can actually help us and tell us, what is the species richness in this particular area of land? And I think what we need to ask ourselves as well is that type of information what investors need to know? Maybe they don't need to know that kind of species abundance and richness, but maybe as a proxy, they could say, if a certain habitat looks like it's restored to a certain level of quality, as we can see from space, that by proxy might mean that there are certain, there's a certain level of species richness.
So what you're saying is that it's very important also to integrate the requirements from the financial market actors and investors in the process of also.
If we're going to speed up this type of financing and actually get the money where it's needed, then we're going to have to start finding some solutions like that. And this is one of the areas that we're really looking at. What data actually is enough? And our work with the European Investment Bank is really trying to navigate that field of what is the data that's enough.
Good enough for transformation.
Exactly, to really start unlocking that investment.
And I've learned during the last year that when you talk to biodiversity experts and ecosystem experts, they do not agree until it's like 100% right. But if it's going to be implemented by the financial system, it is only going to be implemented by 30% if it's 100% right for the biodiversity experts. So we need to understand that good enough might be better because then it will be implemented by 80-90% of the financial system, and we can see not just a modest adjustment but a powerful transformation.
Yes, and this is where the very difficult tension lies between scientists, to say, and then policymakers or decision makers or investors or anyone else in the general public. I'm sorry to say, but it's true. Because often as scientists, and I come from a science background, you do want with rigour to be able to stand behind your results and say with 100% certainty, I know this. And a really nice anecdote was back in March 2020, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the previous Danish Prime Minister, was sitting in front of a whole panel of climate scientists and was basically saying, what number do I take in to the climate COP? And they was like, no, we can give you a number, but it's with about 90% uncertainty, and they just kept on going for another hour. And then he was like, I just need one number. Give me one number. And it's true.
Maybe it's better to start with a number and then be humble and revise.
Exactly.
Lars?
I think do we need to stick to time, perhaps?
No. Yeah, maybe.
We don't need to stick.
I think it's so interesting. So do you have a question? We could.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine what the future development might be here in terms of the metrics, but also also the financial sector, but then this has to co-evolve with legislation, right? Land use regulations and stuff. How do you see the development of this co-evolving?
Well, I think policy will always be slow. So I think...
like scientists. So it's not a good kind of...
By the time we see anything that can actually help regulate the market, that's going to take some time. But we're already seeing that the private investment sector, private finance sector is actually moving ahead with this at light speed. And so this is why I think the time is now that agencies such as ours, together with EIB, together with other financial actors, need to start getting our heads together to try and think of how can we help them actually create some of those baseline indices or baseline matrices that might actually serve as a protocol so that we don't have a proliferation of what does good biodiversity look like, because we want that to be based on science and we want that to actually mean something and not some kind of, supposed good biodiversity action, which actually doesn't do anything at all. So this is where I think the huge urgency, at least for us, is, and I think for all of everyone that's interested in kind of working with nature and investing in nature and restoring that's where the huge urgency is. Hopefully policy will follow suit, but it is a much more slower process, and the more that we can kind of influence that process from the outset, the better.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Riyong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.